Well, you're probably wondering what we're doing in the central New South Wales at a Chinese shrine. Well, there's a story here. It has to do with a place called Laming Flat, and that's very definitive not only of this town but of shaping Australia. Some people say this is where the White Australia policy was born. It's interesting that they've created a beautiful, peaceful spot here. It's just outside of Young in New South Wales, and there's this lovely pool and garden and walk. And I think it's a way of saying that the chapter that happened here in 1861 was very violent, very tragic in lots of ways. Racism, fear, misunderstanding, bridges to be crossed that weren't, the fever of mining and gold. You mix all those things together and you get an explosive mix. So they've tried to create, I think, a place for reflection here where you can think about that story, think about our country, what shapes us, what makes us, what are the values that hold us together. If you were here on January 27th, 1861, you would have seen thousands of Chinese miners fleeing the Laming Flats goldfields, seeking refuge from a riot that was taking place to drive them off the field. A large proportion of miners had come north from the Victorian goldfields as they closed down, and with them came the Chinese, and they just weren't welcome from a lot of the miners. So the pressure built up and it exploded in early 1861, two particular riots which caused a shock right through the colony. The government had to intervene. So we'll tell you more of that story when we go into the town, into the museum. But it's quite a remarkable chapter, and this story of James Roberts and what he did for these fleeing Chinese is, I think, something you really need to know. Well, we're in Young, and it's called the Laming Flat Museum. That's what Young was called before, it was called Young. But just over there is Camp Hill, where there was military action back in the 1860s, a mining riot, and some pretty serious moments in Australia's history. We're going to go inside and find out about the story of the Laming Flat riots. Strange, isn't it, how a simple bit of equipment like this can be at the background of a great search for wealth. This is a rocker that was used on the goldfields in Australia. You poured your sand and gravel in there out of the creek, and then you rocked it, and you got rid of all the big bits, but the gold would stay in the rocker and it'd be washed out, so you'd wash it through with water. But simple pieces of equipment like this, tens of thousands of men came from overseas to Australia hoping to make their fortune. In the 1860s there was a series of very serious riots, and so big sometimes there was 2,000 to 3,000 men involved, demanding that the Chinese be pushed off the goldfields. And even in Sydney there was talk about bringing into Parliament to say no more Chinese allowed into Australia. So here in Laming Flat, some pretty serious things took place. And if you come over here, I'll show you this. Now, the Chinese were very, very threatened, and in fact, in some of these riots there were some pretty bad beatings, and about 1,200 of them had to escape off the fields and away to safety on a farm. I'll come back to that, but on this little scroll here, it was painted in 1987 by a Chinese artist telling the story. Here they are on the goldfields. Here's the beating up that went on. You can see people even cutting off their pigtails. And this little scene here of a fellow called James Roberts and his wife, and who were looking after these 1,200 escaping immigrants, if you like, refugees, came to their farm for safety. They provided a sanctuary. Well, if you go into Australian history, the Laming Flat riots and the mining dispute and the xenophobia and the anti-Chinese sentiment, the White Australia thing, kind of gets the big picture, that fills the screen. But you know, as I was researching this, what came out was an interesting little footnote to the story that adds a moment of grace. two stories in fact. The young widow of a military man, John Wilkie, who died while the military were here and then they were withdrawing. He fell off his horse, apparently had a stroke or something like that and died. So it was quite a tragedy, and there was a funeral here in town and 3,000 miners turned up and full military honours, and apparently he was much respected, and there was a very sober and appreciative note of that young military man who died here. His widow, Margaret, inherited his fortune. I suppose it was quite a bit of money, £3,000. She went back to England specifically to train as a nurse with the Florence Nightingale Hospital, St Thomas's. She was noted as a woman of intelligence, and she said, I want to go back to Lambing Flat to be a minister of grace there. I want to be a nurse there. I want to look out for the poor and the needy people who have, there's not a lot of spiritual health, not a lot of light there in that town. So she came back. So two people of faith, John Roberts, who provided sanctuary, he laid the foundation stone. In fact, he was one of the contributors to building this church, as was Margaret Wilkie. Added a kind of a note of grace to that, what was a pretty ugly incident. And I like to think that one of these invisible stories that comes up like a green shoot and in a hard place, and reminds us of the footsteps of Jesus that are all over this country. And I hope you enjoyed that story. I like that story. And here's to Margaret Wilkie, here's to John Roberts and his wife.